right, welcome back to 10 Minute IO, where you'll find bite-sized information on all topics related to industrial organizational psychology. We're going to be talking about adverse impact today. Um, right off the bat, let me clarify something. Just because a company is predominantly white does not mean that the company is guilty of adverse impact. If you think about companies in the US, especially in the Midwest, majority of those companies will have employees that are predominantly white. If you go to Japan, majority of the companies will have employees that are Japanese. Same thing in any other country. So just because a company has predominantly one particular group does not mean the company is guilty of adverse impact. Another thing I should point out is if you live in a city that's, let's say, half white, half Hispanic, that doesn't mean that all companies operating within that city needs to have 50% white and 50% Hispanic. That would be ludicrous to think that, because not everyone from each of those groups will equally apply to the specific roles within those companies. So it doesn't make sense to believe that just because a city is 50% whites or 50% another group, that the companies should be composed of those demographics. It just doesn't make sense. I'll talk about what specifically adverse impact is. And basically, in a nutshell, adverse impact is about fairness. If candidates apply for a position, we should ethically, morally, hire people who are qualified to do the job. That means we want to hire people who will do well in those particular positions. Now, the problem is that human beings, all of us, are biased. We tend to like people who are like us. We tend to attribute good-looking people with more of certain positive qualities than other less attractive people, and so on. There's a ton of these biases if you think about it. And so that's where we get into this problem of actually hiring people who may or may not be qualified, but simply because we like them. And this happens more often than people realize. So adverse impact has to do with a company's hiring and promotional practices. It occurs if a particular group, and it doesn't have to be just race, ethnicity, it can be sex, it could be age, and so on. But if a particular group is being hired or selected or promoted at a lower rate than another group. What do I mean by lower rate? EEOC, or Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, uses a rule of thumb, and that's called a 4/5 or 80% rule to determine if, in fact, they should investigate a particular company for adverse impact. I'll explain a little more about that 80% rule in the next slide, but one quick point here I'd like to make is that adverse impact can occur either intentionally, that is, the company is actively discriminating against a certain group, or unintentionally, it just happens. But it's still up to the company to make sure that they do not have adverse impact and they gather enough information for their hiring procedures to justify the adverse impact or disproportionate number of candidates from a particular group being hired in order to avoid a serious lawsuit from EEOC. So let's talk about the 80% rule. What do I mean by this? Here's a scenario. Let's say there's 10 white qualified candidates and 10 black qualified candidates. Now, the word qualified here is in quotes. That's important because if they're not qualified for whatever reason, then we cannot count them in the pool when we do the analysis for adverse impact. So we have to make sure that they are qualified candidates. Now let's say these two groups, they apply for a particular company and the company has a screening procedure, so they go through the screening procedure. And by screening procedure, I mean, whatever hiring practice they have. It could be a personality assessment, it could be an intelligence test, it could be a panel interview, and so on. So the whole thing I'm referring to here as a screening procedure. In the first case, let's say 6 out of the 10 white candidates are hired. So this gives us a selection ratio of 60%. Now in the second case, this is relative. We are comparing now the selection ratio for the dominant group to the other group, and we can have two cases or scenarios here. In case one, let's say only 4 out of the 10 are hired. That gives us a selection ratio of 40%. What we do is we take that 40% and divide it by the selection ratio for the dominant group, 60%, and that gives us a percentage 67%. If that number is below 80%, then EEOC can say, okay, we think that there's adverse impact. We are going to investigate this. In scenario 2, we see that 5 out of 10 are hired, so 50%. Now we divide 50% by the 60% selection ratio of the dominant group, and we see that the percentage or ratio here is 83%. So in this case, EEOC will not investigate this particular company because there is, relatively speaking, equal or more than 4/5 of the protected group, sometimes they call. Protected group is being hired compared relative to the dominant group. So in this case, we can say that there is no adverse impact. So what can companies do? I mentioned earlier that companies should, and HR, human resources teams should rigorously gather information about the candidates that apply for a particular position, as well as who actually gets hired, documenting and keeping records of candidates, their hiring rates, promotional decisions, and so on. That's number one. Number two is using valid tools. One thing that many people may not know is that you can actually have adverse impact if you can justify through data that your selection tool, in fact, screens out people who will not perform well on the job in the future. So if you can gather some information about your, let's say, whatever your screening procedure, and you use a set of screening procedures and you derive some score for a candidate or a group of candidates, and let's say you hire all of those candidates and you follow them over, let's say, 6 months to a year, and you gather performance evaluation data. And if you can show that there's a positive correlation between your set of selection tools and actual job performance, you can in fact get away with having adverse impact. One cost-effective way to increase your accuracy, your ability to predict job performance based on your interviews, is to convert your standard interview to what's called a structured interview. And even better would be structured behavioral interviews. I'll talk about that in a future presentation, but I'll leave it at that for now. The last thing here is to incorporate alternative screening tools. Personality assessments have been shown to reduce the potential for adverse impact, meaning that it's unbiased. Oftentimes they've administered personality assessments to a number of different groups, and they find that if you were to make selection decisions based on personality assessments, then you would not have this type of bias that would lead to adverse impact. Now, you don't want to use personality assessments as a sole predictor criteria for selection, but it is a good tool to incorporate in addition to other types of screening tools. Well, thank you for watching. That's about it for adverse impact. Coming up next, we'll be talking about fundamentals of HR data analytics. If you like the video, please share it with others. And if you have topic suggestions, please feel free to email me at the email shown here. Thank you again, and we'll talk to you soon.